3 days after Pearl Harbor, while the wreckage was still smoking in Hawaii, a British admiral did something that should have been impossible. He sailed two of the most powerful warships in the world straight into the same kind of attack, with no fighter cover overhead, and he did it on purpose. He believed a battleship could defend itself. Not with hope. With doctrine. Steel, speed, and enough anti-aircraft guns to turn the sky into a wall of shrapnel. That belief had built the most feared navy on Earth for 3 decades. In the South China Sea, it was about to sink 2 ships and 840 men in under 2 hours. How does a man who watched Italy's battleships get gutted by torpedo planes at Taranto still refuse to believe aircraft could sink his own? His name was Tom Phillips. On December 10, 1941, off the coast of Malaya, his confidence collided with a Japanese naval air doctrine built for exactly this moment, and the age of the battleship ended in an afternoon. Thomas Spencer Vaughan Phillips was born in 1888 in Falmouth, Cornwall, a coastal town that had been sending sons to sea for 3 centuries. He joined the Royal Navy at 15 in 1903 and spent the First World War on destroyers in the Mediterranean and the Far East, learning the trade of surface warfare from the deck up. He was short, barely over 5 feet tall, and the fleet gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career, Tom Thumb. It was said with affection, but it also captured something about how the Navy saw him, a small, sharp, relentlessly capable man who belonged in the minds of his peers behind a desk rather than on a bridge in wartime. And for most of his career, that is exactly where he was. Phillips rose through staff postings, not commands. Commander in 1921, Captain in 1920, Rear Admiral in 1930, each promotion earned in planning rooms and policy meetings, rather than gunnery duels. By 1939, he was Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff, and within months, Vice Chief, one of the most powerful planning officers in the entire Royal Navy, and a man who had won the personal confidence of Winston Churchill. Churchill pushed his promotion to acting Vice Admiral in February 1940 over the objections of officers who considered Phillips exactly what the fleet called him behind his back, a desk admiral, brilliant on paper, untested at sea. But a desk is where doctrine gets written, and Phillips had very firm doctrine. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had studied naval air power for years, rather than dismissed it out of ignorance, that a modern battleship, properly handled, could survive an air attack in open water. Speed, maneuver, and a dense curtain of anti-aircraft fire were, in his view, sufficient defense against bombers and torpedo planes, so long as the ship's captain kept his nerve and his rudder free. Pre-war fleet exercises seemed to back him up. Mock air assaults against Royal Navy battle formations were repeatedly logged as repelled or survivable. Even after Taranto, where the Royal Navy's own carrier aircraft had crippled the Italian battle fleet at anchor in November 1940, Phillips did not treat the lesson as universal. Taranto, in his reading, was a fleet caught at rest, in a harbor, unable to maneuver or shoot back. A battleship at sea, at speed with her guns manned, was an entirely different problem, and he was certain it was a problem the surface fleet could still solve on its own terms. That conviction had a name, even if Phillips himself never needed to say it aloud. The gunline doctrine, the belief that the battleship remained the master of the ocean, that steel and firepower and disciplined seamanship could still outfight anything the sky could throw at it. It was not a reckless idea. It was the accumulated wisdom of a navy that had ruled the waves for 300 years, and it belonged to a man who had spent his whole career mastering that navy's rules on paper. In May 1941, Churchill gave him the chance to test that doctrine for real. Phillips was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Far East Fleet, his first operational sea command of the war. Built around Britain's newest battleship, he left London for Singapore that October, carrying with him 3 decades of naval theory and a belief that was about to meet the one enemy it had never actually been tested against. In October 1941, the Admiralty approved a deployment meant to do one thing: convince Japan that Britain was still willing to fight for the Far East. The centerpiece was HMS Prince of Wales, a brand-new King George V-class battleship, barely a few months out of her builder's yard and already a veteran. She had traded shells with the German battleship Bismarck in the Atlantic that May. Alongside her sailed HMS Repulse, older but fast, a renowned-class battlecruiser that had been at sea since the First World War, and had spent the interwar years patrolling the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. 4 destroyers, Electra, Express, Tenedos, and the Australian Vampire, formed the screen. On paper, it was a formidable squadron. On paper, that was the entire strategy, a show of force strong enough that Japan would think twice. There was supposed to be a 5th ship. The original plan called for a fleet carrier, HMS Indomitable, to sail with the group and give it what a battleship alone could never provide: its own air cover, its own eyes in the sky, its own answer to enemy bombers. Indomitable ran aground during workups in the Caribbean, before she ever reached the Far East, and she never rejoined the force. Phillips sailed for Singapore without her, and without a replacement. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, warned against sending the capital ships east at all. So did Field Marshal John Smuts, Prime Minister of South Africa and a personal friend of Phillips, who addressed the crew of Repulse in Durban, before she continued on to Singapore, and, according to those who heard him, all but predicted their fate. Churchill overruled them. The ships sailed anyway. Waiting on the other side of the South China Sea was an opponent Phillips had spent his career studying in theory, and was about to meet in practice. Japan's naval air doctrine did not center on carriers alone, based in southern French Indochina. Within range of Malaya sat 3 land-based air groups, the Genzan, Mihoro, and Kanoya Kokutai, under the operational direction of Vice Admiral Sadaichi Matsunaga. Between them they fielded 88 aircraft, 34 torpedo bombers, 51 high-altitude level bombers, and 3 long-range scouts. Flying the twin-engine Mitsubishi G3M and G4M aircraft, the British had consistently underestimated for both their range and their specialized training against moving warships. These were not general-purpose bombers pressed into an improvised role. Their crews had drilled for years specifically to sink capital ships underway at sea, at ranges British planners did not believe Japanese aircraft could reach. That was the real trial, though nobody scored it as one at the time. A fleet built around the belief that big guns and disciplined maneuver could outlast anything the sky threw at it, against an air arm built for the exclusive purpose of proving that belief wrong. The two sides came into contact only after Japan moved first. On December 8th, hours after the strike on Pearl Harbor reached Singapore by cable, Japanese troops began landing at Kota Baru on the northeast coast of Malaya. Opening the ground invasion force Z had been sent east to Dater. Phillips saw the landing as exactly the opportunity his squadron existed for, a chance to catch Japanese invasion convoys in the open water and destroy them before they could put more men ashore. He chose not to coordinate with the Royal Australian Air Force or the RAF's Far East Air Force before sailing, and he left his Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Arthur Palliser, ashore in Singapore to run the shore command post. At 17:35 that evening, Force Z put to sea. Phillips signaled the fleet as they left harbor, telling his men plainly what lay ahead. They were out looking for trouble, he said, and no doubt they would find it. He expected, if anything, to run into the Japanese battleship Congo somewhere in the dark. He did not expect what was actually waiting for him. Somewhere north, in the humid air over French Indochina, 88 aircraft sat fueled and armed, and the men who flew them had spent years training for exactly this kind of night. Prince of Wales had barely finished her sea trials when the war put her to the test. Commissioned on January 19, 1941, still trailing dockyard workers who had not had time to come ashore, she was rushed into the North Atlantic that May alongside the battlecruiser HMS Hood to intercept the German battleship Bismarck, which had broken out into the shipping lanes with orders to destroy British convoys. What followed, in the Denmark Strait on the morning of May 24th, was one of the most consequential naval actions of the war. Hood was struck in her magazine and destroyed in under 5 minutes, taking all but 3 of her crew down with her. Prince of Wales, still working up, still finding the bugs in her brand-new 14-inch turrets, kept fighting. She took 7 hits from Bismarck and Prince Eugen and pulled back under a smokescreen, but not before landing 3 shells of her own on Bismarck, one of which tore into the German battleship's fuel bunkers. That single hit did what British planners could not have scripted. It forced Bismarck to abandon her commerce raid and turn for occupied France. Bleeding oil the whole way, a wound that put her directly in the path of the pursuit that sank her 3 days later. A ship not yet finished being built had helped end the hunt for one of the most feared warships in the world, for a fleet whose entire doctrine rested on the idea that a well-handled battleship could still decide a battle. It was as close to proof as the war had offered. 2 months later, Prince of Wales carried Winston Churchill across the Atlantic to Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, for the meeting with President Roosevelt that produced the Atlantic Charter, the ship serving for a moment as the literal platform for Anglo-American strategy. In September, she was back in the Mediterranean for Operation Halberd, escorting a vital convoy through to besieged Malta, and helping shoot down attacking Italian aircraft along the way. In under a year of active service, she had traded fire with the Kriegsmarine's most dangerous ship, hosted a summit that shaped the alliance that would win the war, and turned back an Italian air raid. By the standards of any navy in this world, that was a combat record that justified confidence, not doubt. Repulse carried a longer version of the same story. Laid down in 1915 and commissioned the following year, she had joined the Grand Fleet as flagship of the 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron, and seen action at the Battle of Heligoland Bight in November 1917. She survived the interwar years of budget cuts that scrapped so many of her sister ships, was rebuilt at Portsmouth in the 1930s, carried the Prince of Wales on a world tour, and stood off Alexandria during the Abyssinian crisis of 1936. When war came again, she operated off Norway in 1940, and spent more than a year on North Atlantic convoy duty before steaming, in August 1941 to Placentia Bay to help carry Churchill to the same Atlantic conference her future flagmate had attended. 2 ships, a quarter-century apart in age, each with a service record that read like an argument for exactly the kind of doctrine Phillips believed in. Put a battleship to sea, keep her crew sharp and her guns manned, and she could still handle whatever came at her. They arrived together in Singapore on December 2, 1941, and for 6 days that argument held. On December 6, patrolling aircraft from Force Z spotted Japanese troop convoys moving through the South China Sea, the first hard evidence that an invasion was imminent. 2 days later, hours after Pearl Harbor, Japan struck at Kota Baru, and Force Z got its first look at the enemy. It had actually been sent to fight. Japanese reconnaissance and bomber aircraft appeared overhead, and Prince of Wales opened fire with her anti-aircraft batteries. She scored no hits, but she was not hit either. The guns worked, the ship maneuvered, the sky stayed survivable. Phillips signaled the Admiralty requesting RAF fighter cover to meet the fleet at sea. None arrived. It did not seem to matter yet. The ships were still afloat, still fast, still armed. And the doctrine that had carried Prince of Wales through the Denmark Strait and Repulse through a world war and a world tour had so far cost Force Z nothing. By the evening of December 9th, 2 of the most combat-tested capital ships in the Royal Navy were steaming north through the dark toward the Japanese invasion fleet, their record intact, their admiral certain, and 88 aircraft closing the distance from the north. The same conviction that had carried Prince of Wales through the Denmark Strait now worked against Force Z in a way nobody on the bridge fully understood until it was too late. Phillips had built his career and his doctrine on the idea that a battleship at sea did not need to lean on anyone else, not aircraft, not luck, just steel, gunnery, and discipline. That belief now expressed itself as something quieter and far more dangerous than overconfidence in armor plate, a refusal to ask for help. The gap in the plan had been there from the start, and it was not really Phillips's to fix. For years, British defense strategy in the Far East had rested on what planners called the Singapore strategy, the assumption that the main battle fleet would sail out from Britain in a crisis, and that Singapore itself only needed to hold long enough for that fleet to arrive. Under that assumption, nobody had invested in modern fighter aircraft for Malaya. The only air cover available to Force Z was 10 Brewster Buffaloes of the Royal Australian Air Force's 453 Squadron, based at Sembawang, a fighter already outclassed by frontline Japanese aircraft before the war even reached Malaya. Even if Phillips had called for them at the first sign of trouble, they could not have loitered continuously over his ships hundreds of miles from their airfield. The bureaucratic failure was decades deep, and it had already limited his options before Force Z ever left harbor. What compounded it was a communication that went wrong at the worst possible moment. At 2300 on the night of December 8th, Phillips's Chief of Staff in Singapore, Rear Admiral Arthur Palliser, sent a signal warning that fighter protection would not, repeat not, be possible on Wednesday the 10th. Palliser meant it narrowly. He was referring to a specific planned operation in the Gulf of Siam. Phillips read it as a blanket statement. No fighter cover was coming, period. He never asked Palliser to clarify. Later, officers who served alongside him, including Flight Lieutenant Tim Viggers, the RAAF pilot who had been given Force Z's own radio codes for exactly this purpose, would carry lasting bitterness over how easily a single request could have changed the outcome and how that request never came. Instead, Phillips leaned harder into the doctrine he trusted, convinced that his ships could handle themselves without support and wary of giving away his position. He maintained strict radio silence rather than break it to ask Singapore for cover. He had reportedly told colleagues before the war that bombers were no match for battleships, and whether or not he said those exact words, he sold as if he believed them completely. He also believed the nearest Japanese airbase capable of reaching him was some 400 miles away, well beyond what he thought Japanese medium bombers could manage on a strike-and-return mission. It was a reasonable estimate by the standards of every other air force in the world in 1941. It was wrong about this one. The Genzan, Mihoro, and Kanoya air groups had trained for exactly this kind of extended-range torpedo strike. And 400 miles was well inside their reach. The Japanese found him before he ever found them. On the rainy, low-visibility afternoon of December 9th, the submarine I-65 sighted Force Z in the Gulf of Siam and began shadowing it, radioing position reports back to the Japanese fleet for the rest of the day. A sudden squall briefly hid the British ships, and I-65 lost contact after a false alarm sent it into a crash dive. But by 1830 that evening, the weather cleared and 3 Japanese reconnaissance float planes appeared over the flagship. Phillips understood immediately what it meant. His position was compromised. His surprise was gone, and continuing north served no purpose. He gave the order to reverse course and run for Singapore at high speed. Had he held that course for the rest of the night, Force Z would likely have reached harbor intact. And this would be a very different story. It did not hold. As Force Z steamed south, signal traffic from Singapore painted an increasingly desperate picture of the ground war. The British Army falling back across Malaya, the front collapsing faster than headquarters could track it. Shortly before midnight, a report reached Phillips of a Japanese landing at Kuantan, roughly halfway between Kota Baru and Singapore, almost directly on his current line of retreat. It was the kind of opportunity his entire mission had been built around, a chance to catch an invasion force in the open and do the damage Force Z had been sent east to do. He ordered his ships to divert and make a high-speed run for the coast. His 3 remaining destroyers were, by this point, running low on fuel from the night's constant evasive maneuvering. He had already detached torpedoes back toward Singapore to conserve her fuel, unknowingly sending her into a separate encounter with searching Japanese aircraft that would later help confirm Force Z's general location. Force Z arrived off Kuantan at dawn on December 10. The destroyer Express went in first to scout the harbor and found it empty. No landing craft, no troop transports, no sign that any invasion had ever happened there. The report had been false, a phantom built from confused or outdated intelligence. Phillips had burned the entire night, and his best chance of slipping home unseen, chasing an enemy that was never there. A Supermarine Walrus float plane launched from Prince of Wales confirmed the same thing from the air. Nothing at Kuantan but empty beach. Phillips turned his ships back toward Singapore once more, still maintaining radio silence, still not asking for the fighter cover that might, even now, have reached him in time. He never got the chance to find out. While Express searched the empty harbor, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and a second submarine, I-58, had already relocated Force Z. I-58 fired a spread of torpedoes at Repulse and missed. It did not matter. The position had been reported, and back at the airfields in southern Indochina, air crews who had spent years training for precisely this mission were already climbing into their bombers. The same belief that had made Phillips confident enough to sail without air cover and disciplined enough to keep his radio silent through every hour that followed had cost him the two things that might have saved his command: an early warning and a fighter screen already overhead when the first Japanese engines appeared on the horizon. At 10 o'clock on the morning of December 10th, the destroyer Tenedos, detached the night before and running alone back toward Singapore, radioed that she was under attack by Japanese bombers. It was the first hard sign that the enemy had found them. An hour later, at 11:07, lookouts aboard Repulse spotted aircraft closing from the north. Captain William Tennant's voice went out over the ship's tannoy. Enemy aircraft approaching. Action stations. On Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach gave the same order within seconds. Every ship in the squadron surged to 25 knots. Guns swung skyward, and Force Z began the violent weaving maneuvers that were supposed to be its salvation. The first wave came in at 12,000 feet. 9 Mitsubishi bombers of the Mihoro Kokutai releasing their loads on Repulse. One 500-kilogram bomb found her boat deck. A glancing wound, more fire than flood, and a scatter of near misses threw up water around her hull without breaking it. She kept fighting, kept her speed, and the destroyer Electra's crew cheered as she came through it. For a few minutes, the doctrine looked like it was working exactly the way Phillips had always said it would. Then came the torpedoes. At 11:44, a single aircraft put one into Prince of Wales's port side, aft, and the ship that had traded shells with Bismarck 7 months earlier took a wound she would never recover from. The blast wrecked both port propeller shafts at once. One kept spinning, wrenched and unbalanced, tearing itself deeper into the hull with every rotation, ripping open compartments that had never been designed to flood. Seawater poured into the dynamo rooms and drowned the electrical plant that ran the ship's pumps and steering gear. Within minutes, Prince of Wales was listing 11.5 degrees. Unable to steer, her speed falling away, Leach had no choice but to run 2 blackballs up the yardarm. The signal, understood by every navy in the world, for not under control. The most modern battleship in the Royal Navy was now, for practical purposes, a drifting target, and still, no signal went out asking Singapore for help. It was Tennant, watching from Repulse and unable to believe what he was seeing, who finally broke the silence himself. At 11:58, he transmitted in the clear to any British warship listening, enemy aircraft bombing, giving his position without waiting for permission from his admiral. 22 minutes later, Prince of Wales finally sent her own message, not a request for cover, but a bare statement of fact that she had been struck by a torpedo on her port side. The call for help that could have brought the Buffalo fighters from Sembawang overhead an hour earlier had, in the end, come from the ship that was not even the flagship, and even then it came too late to change anything in the sky above Force Z that day. Repulse, meanwhile, was still alive and still fighting in a way that bordered on the miraculous. Tennant threw her through one violent turn after another, combing the wakes of incoming torpedoes, and by the time the second full wave arrived, she had already dodged 19 of them. Her gunners brought down 2 aircraft that overflew her bow too low and too slow, watching them burst into flame and fall into the sea. But the Japanese crews adjusted their approach, splitting into groups and attacking from multiple bearings at once so that no single turn could save her from all of them. 17 bombers came in from her starboard side. As she committed to evading that group, 3 more peeled off and struck at her port side instead. She took a hit amidships on her anti-torpedo bulge trying to dodge the first wave. And then, moments later, the second group scored 3 more hits along her port side, one of them near the stern, jamming her steering completely. There was no more dodging after that. Repulse began to heel hard to port, faster than anyone aboard could control, and Tennant gave the order every captain dreads giving: abandon ship. She rolled over just 11 minutes after that first torpedo had struck her, her screws still turning in the air as her bow rose and her stern went under. at roughly 12:33 in the afternoon. Of the 109 men aboard, 513 went down with her or died in the water and burning fuel oil around her hull. Tennant himself never intended to leave. His own sailors grabbed him bodily and threw him over the side rather than let him go down with his ship. He was pulled from the sea and lived. Prince of Wales lasted 15 minutes longer, and for her crew, those 50 minutes were arguably worse. Crippled, listing, barely able to steer, she had lost most of her anti-aircraft power, along with her electrical systems, and could offer only a fraction of the defense she had shown against Bismarck 7 months before. The Japanese bombers, no longer needing to worry about Repulse, turned their full attention on her. A bomb punched through her upper decks and detonated in one of the last functioning boiler rooms. Another struck near the makeshift hospital where most of her wounded were being treated, killing men who had already survived the first torpedo strike only to die from the second attack. Stunned sailors staggered through smoke and darkness below decks, many trapped in compartments that had lost all power and all way out. At 1:15, Leach finally gave the order to abandon ship, but with the ship's communication systems destroyed, the order never reached large sections of the crew, and men still at their action stations far below the waterline drowned, without ever hearing it. Through all of it, Phillips said almost nothing. He had not addressed his men once during the entire engagement, had made no attempt to transfer his flag to one of the destroyers still capable of maneuvering freely, and gave no final order beyond signaling the Destroyer Express to come alongside and take off the wounded and men who were no longer needed at their posts. Whether it was shock or the particular stillness of a man watching his own convictions come apart in real time, no one who survived could say for certain. At around 1:18 to 1:20 in the afternoon, Prince of Wales rolled to port and slipped under the surface of the South China Sea. Phillips and Leach went down with her. Neither man made any visible effort to save himself. The destroyers Electra, Express, and the Australian Vampire moved in immediately, working through burning oil and drifting wreckage to pull more than 2,000 men out of the water. Overhead, the Buffalo fighters of 453 Squadron finally arrived from Sembawang at around 1:30, not in time to turn back a single attacking bomber, but in time to fly cover over the rescue and keep the Japanese from strafing the men in the sea. It was, in the bluntest possible sense, too little assistance arriving after the only moment when assistance could have mattered. Of 85 Japanese aircraft committed to the attack, only 3 or 4 were shot down, and 18 Japanese airmen were killed. Against that, Britain's official reckoning stood at 840 dead, 327 from Prince of Wales, 513 from Repulse. Though the Force Z Survivors Association would later compile its own figure closer to 760, a discrepancy that has never been fully resolved and that no honest telling of this story can paper over. By early afternoon, Force Z no longer existed as a fighting force. What remained of it, 3 destroyers, low on fuel, carrying survivors wrapped in blankets and coated in oil, turned for Singapore. The only significant British naval strength in the entire Far East gone in under 2 hours. The next morning, a Japanese pilot named Haruki Iki, who had led one of the torpedo squadrons in the attack, flew low and alone over the patch of ocean where the 2 ships had gone down, and dropped bundles of flowers onto the water, in tribute to the men his squadron had killed. It was a small, quiet gesture from one side of a battle that had otherwise been almost entirely one-sided. A reminder that even the men who had just proven Phillips's doctrine wrong understood exactly what had been lost beneath the waves. Word of the sinking reached London within hours, and Winston Churchill later wrote that no other single event of the war, apart from the fall of France, struck him with greater shock. He was right to be shaken, because the disaster off Kwanton was not an isolated tragedy. It was the opening chapter of a much larger collapse. With Force Z gone, the Royal Navy had no capital ships left in the Far East, and Britain's entire Eastern Fleet strategy, built for a decade around the assumption that battleships would deter or defeat any Japanese move against Singapore, evaporated in an afternoon. 10 weeks later, on February 15, 1942, Singapore itself surrendered to a Japanese force that in places was outnumbered by its own captives, the worst capitulation in the history of the British Army, and one that Churchill's own government had been counting on the Navy and ships like Prince of Wales to prevent. The verdict on Tom Phillips has never fully settled, and any honest account of this story has to leave room for both sides of it. To his harshest critics, the failures were his alone. The decision to sail without confirming air cover, the refusal to break radio silence when it could have summoned fighters, the chase after a phantom landing at Kwanton that cost him his last window to escape undetected. To his defenders, and there have been serious naval historians among them, Phillips was handed an impossible command from the start, a scratch force with no carrier, thrown into a theater where fighter aircraft, radar, and intelligence had all been starved of investment for a generation, and then asked to do with 2 ships what should have required an entire fleet. One Australian naval historian went so far as to call him a scapegoat for failures. The missing carrier, the underfunded air defenses, the flawed Kwanton intelligence that were never within his power to fix. Both readings can be true at once. Phillips inherited a strategy built on faith in the battleship, and he personally supplied the final fatal confidence that kept that faith intact past the point it deserved. What is not in dispute is what the battle proved, whether anyone in London wanted it proven or not. Prince of Wales and Repulse were the first capital ships in history sunk by aircraft alone while underway, fully crewed, fully armed, and actively defending themselves at sea, not caught at anchor the way the Italian fleet had been at Taranto, not trapped in a harbor the way the American battleships had been 3 days earlier at Pearl Harbor. This was a fair fight between a battleship's guns and a bomber's torpedo, in open water, and the bomber had won decisively. Navies around the world had been debating the balance between big guns and aircraft for over a decade. Force Z ended the debate in less than 2 hours, and every fleet still holding on to the old doctrine, including, in places, the United States Navy's own battleship admirals, had to reckon with it. 6 months later, at Coral Sea and then Midway, carriers finished the argument for good. The wrecks themselves still lie roughly 60 miles off the coast of Kwanton, upside down on the seabed, protected today under British law as official war graves, and diving on them without permission is a criminal offense. Illegal salvage has, over the decades, stripped some of their bronze and steel regardless, a quiet second tragedy layered on top of the first. In more recent years, the Royal Navy has treated the site with the formal respect it always deserved. Divers have visited to conduct surveys and pay tribute. And in 2025, a Royal Navy dive team recovered the ship's bells from both wrecks, an act meant less as salvage than as remembrance, bringing home 2 physical objects to stand for the 840 men who never got that chance themselves. A permanent memorial to the 2 ships and their crews was dedicated in London in December 2011, in the presence of the handful of survivors still alive 70 years after the sinking, inscribed with a line that could serve as an epitaph for the entire doctrine that sent them east. Those who go down to the sea in great ships see the works of the Lord and the wonders of the deep. Neither Prince of Wales nor Repulse left behind a company, a factory, or a design bureau to carry their name forward the way an aircraft manufacturer might. Their legacy is written instead in doctrine, in the aircraft carriers that took the battleship's place at the center of every major navy's planning for the rest of the war and for the decades after it, and in the simple, unavoidable fact that no navy on Earth ever again sent a capital ship to sea, unescorted by air cover, and called it sound strategy. The ships were vindicated as fighting machines. Both had proven in earlier battles that they could take punishment and hand it back. It was the idea that sent them out alone that history judged, and history judged it without mercy. The battleship was a philosophy of mass, steel, armor, and a disciplined gunnery. Built up over 3 centuries of naval tradition, the conviction that enough firepower and enough seamanship could answer any threat the enemy put in the water or in the sky. The bomber was a philosophy of reach. No armor to speak of, no need to close the range, just an engine, a torpedo, and years of training aimed at a single question: how far can we hit something before it ever sees us coming? One philosophy had ruled the ocean since Trafalgar. The other had been dismissed, doubted, and underfunded for two decades by the very navy it was about to humiliate. Tom Phillips did not fail because he was careless. He failed because he was certain in a way that 300 years of naval history had taught men like him to be certain the way a desk admiral becomes certain when his whole career has been built on doctrine rather than doubt. The same conviction that let Prince of Wales stand and trade fire with Bismarck let her sail toward Kuantan without an escort of fighters overhead. The same discipline that kept her radio silent to protect her position kept her silent long after that silence had stopped protecting anyone. The strength and the flaw were never two different things. They were the same decision, made by the same man, at two different moments in the same war. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the United States lost its battleships to a surprise attack in a harbor, at anchor, with no chance to fight back. 3 days later, in open water, fully crewed, fully armed, doing exactly what a battleship was built to do, Britain lost hers anyway. That is the detail history remembers least and should remember most. Prince of Wales and Repulse were not caught asleep. They were caught believing. In 1941, a man who had spent 30 years mastering the rules of one kind of war sailed east. Certain those rules still applied. I was out looking for trouble, and no doubt he found it. 88 aircraft, trained for years for exactly this afternoon, proved in under 2 hours what no admiral, no committee, and no exercise had been able to prove in peacetime. The age of the battleship did not end with a bang loud enough for the whole world to hear at once. It ended quietly, off a coast most people had never heard of, in the time it takes to eat lunch. And somewhere above the wreckage, the next morning, one of the men who had helped sink them flew back alone and let flowers fall into the water, where 840 sailors had gone down with the ships they had trusted to bring them home.